Government Goes Missing in the European Union by Bill Mitchell. On Tuesday, June 9, 2020, Eurostat published the March quarter national accounts data for the EU and the Eurozone. GDP down by 3.6% and employment down by 0.2% in the euro area, which revealed that the decline in GDP were the sharpest declines observed since time series started in 1995. Of course, Europe went into this crisis in poor shape. Eurostat noted that in the fourth quarter of 2019, GDP had grown by 0.1% in both the euro area and the EU. So it was barely crawling anyway due to the austerity bias that is built into the monetary system. The larger member states, such as France and Italy, negative 5.3%, and Spain, negative 5.2%, are in terrible shape. In the last few weeks, we have been hearing and reading a lot of hype from European politicians about Hamilton moments, as various euro figures are bandied around about government support for the European economy. Emma Clancy's article, June 6, 2020, Behind the Spin on the EU's Recovery Plan, is sobering if you are drunk on all the Euro elite hype. There isn't really a recovery plan at all, nor any significant shift in attitudes towards creating a functional federation, the only structure that will see Europe break free of this austerity bias. And as I examined the Eurostat data in more detail, something very stark was apparent. The coronavirus crisis is global, which means one cannot accuse the EU of anything in that regard. In general, lockdown strategies were at the discretion of the member state governments, and the variable outcomes reflect the veracity of decision-making at that level. It is clear that some member states waited too long or have opened up too early, and the consequences are for all to see. But the economic policies of the member states is another matter. Let's start with this graph, which was part of Eurostat's published data release. It shows the GDP components and their contributions to growth being a euphemism for Europe these days. What was striking about this graph to me is that only inventories were contributing to growth. See below. In a period where the private sectors of the member states were in meltdown as a result of the lockdowns, and it was obvious that GDP would take a huge hit, the sector that could have stepped in to the breach, I rephrase, should have stepped in to support employment and incomes, was absent. Absent isn't exactly correct. The general government sector actually undermined growth. I found that result stunning and an exemplification of what is wrong with Europe these days. Its structures and cultures have combined to create dysfunctional responses from government to crises. Eurostat note that, quote, during the first quarter of 2020, household final consumption expenditure decreased by 4.7% in the euro area and by 4.3% in the EU, after plus 0.1% in the EU area and plus 0.3% in the EU in the previous quarter. Gross fixed capital formation decreased by 5.3% in the euro area and by 3.9% in the EU, after plus 5% and plus 4.3% respectively. Exports decreased by 4.2% in the euro area and by 3.5% in the EU, after plus 0.1% and negative 0.1% respectively. Imports decreased by 3.6% in the euro area and by 3.2% in the EU, after positive 1.9% and positive 1.5% respectively. End quote. And this translated into the following contributions to the GDP outcome. Quote, household final consumption expenditure had a strong negative contribution to GDP growth in both the euro area and the EU, negative 2.5 and negative 2.3 percentage points, pp respectively. And the contribution from gross fixed capital formation was also negative in both zones, negative 1 and negative 0.9 percentage points respectively, as was the contribution of the external balance. The contribution of changes in inventories was positive for both zones, positive 0.3 percentage points for the euro area and positive 0.4 percentage points for the EU. End quote. Two things to note. 1. They don't mention the government sector at all. 2. The only positive contributor to growth in the EU and Eurozone were inventories. What does that mean? It means that sales were so weak and below the expectations of producers when they committed working capital to producing the goods and services that there was an unexpected or unintended inventory accumulation. In the National Accounts Framework, the statistician considered unintended inventory accumulation to be a component of capital formation or investment, and so the buildup of unsold goods is an investment for the future. Which sounds good, investment, but is actually an additional sign of disaster. I investigated further. The following graphs show the contributions to GDP growth of general government final consumption expenditure in percentage points, for the Eurozone first, then the European Union without the UK. The data confirms what we know. When times are tough in the Eurozone, the government goes missing. During the global financial crisis, government recurrent expenditure was exacerbating the decline in private sector spending. And in the March quarter 2020, just when you expect the government sector to be injecting fiscal support, it once again undermines growth, making the economic consequences of the pandemic worse. Given the dominance of the Euro 19 member states in the EU 27, the graph is similar. In other words, at crucial times in the recent economic history of Europe, government recurrent spending has been pro-cyclical. What does that mean? It means that when the private economic cycle is going down, the government spending cycle follows it and makes it worse. That is the anathema of irresponsible fiscal policy management. But it is a central characteristic of the economic and monetary union, which forced nations to surrender their currencies and then imposed ridiculously pernicious fiscal rules on the governments for political reasons. The result is a dysfunctional monetary system and millions of people being unnecessarily unemployed and disadvantaged as a result. I investigated further. Why? Well, because it might have been that the austerity bias was just concentrated on recurrent consumption expenditure and the overall negative impact of the government sector was attenuated by its contribution via gross capital formation or investment spending. This is the spending that builds transport infrastructure, schools, hospitals, urban infrastructure, and that sort of essential capacity. It also provides a basis for private sector capital expenditure, leveraging of the public infrastructure. Given the way the data is presented by Eurostat, it is more difficult to decompose the aggregate investment data into sectors. We know from the March quarter national accounts that gross fixed capital formation decreased by 4.3% in the euro area and by 3.9% in the EU. And the contribution from gross fixed capital formation was also negative in both zones, negative 1 and negative 0.9 percentage points respectively. So it is hardly likely that government investment spending was so large that it offset the recurrent austerity. First, the overall investment ratio in the Eurozone slumped from 23.7% in the December quarter 2007 to a low of 19.3% by the March quarter 2013. Overall, capital formation slumped 21.1% over that period. It is still below the pre-global financial crisis peak. By March quarter 2020, total investment spending in the Eurozone was only a fraction above the December quarter 2007 value, index value of 100.1 compared to 100. So, for more than 12 years, total investment spending in the Eurozone has been below the level it reached just prior to the global financial crisis. That alone is a damning statistic. The following graph shows the performance of the member states, where data is available, in terms of the percentage point deviation from the December quarter 2007 levels of total gross capital formation evident in the March quarter 2020. A negative bar indicates that the level is below the December quarter 2007 level. Estonia is 9.4% below. Greece 64% lower, shocking policy abuse. Spain 24.4%, Italy 25.4%, Cyprus 15.7%, Latvia 30.2%, Lithuania 16.1%, Netherlands 12.2%, Portugal 15.2%, Slovenia 33.2%. So the application of the fiscal rules and the austerity mindset within the Eurozone has meant that several of the largest economies and smaller ones have been undermining their future productivity and prosperity by creating conditions where governments and businesses stopped investing in new capacity and technologies. The pain of that folly will resonate for generations to come. This is how bad the dysfunctional monetary system they created is. Using AMECO data, I investigated further. This data allows us to split gross capital formation in millions of euros in the government and private sectors. Number 1. For the period 2008 to 2014, public investment expenditure fell by 14.3% in the Eurozone, so the austerity was impacting negatively on both recurrent and capital spending during the worst of the global financial crisis. Number 2. Between 2008 and the end of 2019, public investment expenditure has only grown by 1.42% overall. In other words, hardly at all. Number 3. But the spatial divergence is huge in a monetary system that was claimed to be constructed to promote convergence across Europe. Number 4. Between 2008 and 2014, public investment expenditure fell by 1.8% in Estonia, 56.7% in Ireland, 51.37% in Greece, 56.64% in Spain, 26.81% in Italy, 39.56% in Cyprus, 26.56% in Lithuania, 16.82% in Latvia, 8.04% in the Netherlands, 48.18% in Portugal. Number 5. Between 2008 and 2019, public investment expenditure fell by 28.14% in Ireland, 69.1% in Greece, 47.6% in Spain, 19.31% in Italy, 29.3% in Cyprus, 21.28% in Lithuania, 37.07% in Portugal. These contractions are catastrophic in terms of future productivity growth and prosperity. They undermine the ability of nations to pay higher real wages without impacting on inflation. It is obvious that the fiscal positions of the member states have moved to lower deficits, higher surpluses since the global financial crisis. But part of that shift has been the systematic trashing of economic potential, which will blight the member states for generations. The cuts to public capital expenditure signify a lost past and an endangered future. Conclusion. For those progressives who hang on to the dream of Europe that works, this data should be enough to tell you that the system they claim to support will never deliver the dream they long for. This is massively dysfunctional system. Even at a time when the world has fallen into the worst economic crisis in nearly 100 years, along with a health emergency not seen since the early 19th century, the governments still cannot break free and underpin growth. The data released this week by Eurostat, as shown in the initial graph above, is stunning really, and I have been examining data for quite a while now. That is enough for today.